Okay, I think we can go ahead and get started. It's a minute after 12. So thank you so much for being here today. My name is Kate Paisani and I work at Carla. And before I introduce our speakers, I just want to direct your attention to the screen. We have two more presentations this semester. The next one is on November 13th. It happens to be a presentation by myself and my colleague Mandy Menke. And then our last presentation is on December 4th. I believe that Karen is going to put in the chat a link to where you can register for those presentations. You have to register for each one individually because there is a unique Zoom link for those. So our talk today is part of a series that we do that features graduate students and their faculty mentors who have received a Carla Summer Graduate Research Assistantship. And so this project, which is titled Unleashing AI for Language Teaching and Learning, was co-led by Amanda DeLola and Sabrina Flugel. And Sabrina is a PhD candidate in Hispanic linguistics here at the University of Minnesota. And Amanda is the director of the Language Center in the College of Liberal Arts and also an associate professor of linguistics here at the University of Minnesota. The chat will be open during the talk. Please feel free to use that to back channel and to ask any questions that you have of Amanda and Sabrina, and I will facilitate the Q&A at the end. And I'll hand things over to our presenters.
Thank you, Kate. Thanks everyone for joining us today. We're really excited to talk about our project. So I'm Amanda, and my colleague Sabrina is with me. And we're here to talk to you today about unleashing AI chatbots for language teaching and learning. To give you a little bit of the overview of where we'll head today, because we have lots of things to share, we'll start with the origin story of this project, how we got going, why we got going, what was this sort of a response to. Then we'll talk a little bit about the background research we did to inform the project that we made. After that, we will talk about the product that we made, which is an open educational resource, or OER, that is in the form of a prompt database where you can copy paste prompts and put them directly into chatbots for activities in world languages. So we'll talk to you about how we generated our prompts and then tested them, went back and tweaked them to the final product that you ultimately see before you. We'll talk about the framework we decided to adopt to describe and tag these prompts so that they could be easily searchable and understandable by language instructors. And then we will actually introduce you to the database itself, which lives on a website, which we'll share with you. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about the limitations that we experienced, things that we learned, and conclusions and next steps for sort of where we're headed with this project. So our origin story is one of something that won't surprise many of you if you've been a language teacher in the last couple of years. So I think it was November 2022 that ChatGPT sort of took the world by storm, and some people's eyes glazed over in wonder and other people panicked. But we recognize, Sabrina and I, as sort of language learners and language teachers, that there's a lot of potential in the world of chatbots. So if you think about them in terms of just what they can do, the ability to interact with a chatbot is a new and exciting frontier, particularly for teachers and also for learners who are learning on their own, because what they provide is sort of this unlimited access to a skilled user of a wide variety of languages. And we can talk a little bit about how some languages are more represented than others. But what's really sort of exciting is that you've got this multi-purpose thing on the other side that's able to interact with you in situations where the language is involved, but also in situations where you're talking about some aspect of the language, sort of meta-linguistically. Sabrina and I have been working in the university for a while, and so we hear from our colleagues, there's this sort of moment of hesitation and sometimes skepticism in using chatbots. There are questions of ethics. There's this idea of, well, what about bias? And so what we really want to say here is that don't throw the chatbot out with the water, right? The idea that like these chatbots have been trained on human-generated corpora, and in some cases they've been trained on different sets of data than others. But what we're seeing in terms of bias is a reflection of many of the same social, linguistic, and cultural biases that are already encoded in human languages. And so I think what it's done for us as learners and teachers is really bring it to the forefront. When it gets presented to us in a new light, we realize, wow, we didn't necessarily pay attention to the fact that this kind of bias already existed in human language. So there's this moment of there's so much potential, but should we? And so people kind of are sitting on their hands wondering, like, is there a way to use this that can be productive? We're here to tell you that yes, there is, and we've tried to do a lot of the legwork and lightening the lift. But a lot of it, again, is sort of a new frontier in terms of technical skills. Language teachers have many responsibilities, and so teachers of any pursuit find themselves at this moment right now of maybe not having the time or the interest or the expertise to spend a bunch of their time resources in figuring out what are the best practices for using these kinds of tools. Here we've put prompt engineering, which is what we will talk about, which was the crux of our project here today. What does it take to write a good prompt? What kinds of things do you need to articulate, and what can you leave off? And then how do you test these so that they're appropriate and meaningful in pedagogical situations? So we really want to sort of arrive here with the creation of this product today at this intersection of exciting potential, but also skepticism and hesitation, and the idea that we all have limited resources, especially time. And so how can we do this in a way that will be productive on both sides?
Yeah, so now we'll jump into the research that influenced our work. So main findings from background research tells us that chatbots are beneficial for language learning. Young learners find chatbots engaging. There have been significant improvements found in students' language skills after interacting with chatbots as a form of, a person to have an interaction with, not a person, I shouldn't say that, somebody else to talk to in terms of learning the language. And then students have shown enhanced engagement and motivation when having this technical tool as a resource to be able to practice their language skills. These findings reinforce our exploration of chatbots in world language education, particularly in the way that they can enhance cultural linguistics and sociolinguistic competencies. So we were inspired, of course, by all of this previous work, and then took this work to emphasize that chatbots are tools that can help students promote gains in vocabulary, conversational skills, and then also it gives us an opportunity to critically analyze chatbot interactions. What are the benefits? What are the challenges, limitations, etc.? And in summarizing this previous research, it's obviously really important to address what these studies have highlighted in terms of potential challenges of chatbot use. The key issues highlighted are generally technical limitations, so accessibility of chatbots, licensing at a higher level of multiple users, things like that, data privacy, and then lack of personalized feedback, which we've addressed in our prompts by being able to ask the chatbot for specific feedback in particular prompts. And these studies directly influence our aim to create an OER that's very comprehensive and aligned with AI-driven prompts that give real-world, context-rich interactions for language learners. So now we'll jump into prompt generation and testing and how we got to the big database that we have with all the prompts. So we began by identifying linguistic and cultural competencies that we wanted learners to develop with these prompts, and we aligned them with the ACTFL proficiency guidelines, which all of you know are categorized by levels novice, intermediate, and advanced. We started by confirming ChatGPT's familiarity with these guidelines. So asking it, are you familiar with it? Having it tell us what are the guidelines, checking those with the most recent information on ACTFL's website. And then we also provided the chatbot with the 2024 documentation from ACTFL to make sure everything it has is as recent as what we have access to. We then created and categorized the prompts by proficiency level. So we created prompts with ChatGPT, asking it what needs to be included in the prompts, and then having it spit out a bunch of prompts organized by proficiency level. We then went through the ACTFL guidelines and ensured that prompts were categorized according to novice, intermediate, and advanced, and that they were appropriately challenging based on the learner's abilities at each of those levels. Then we incorporated skill domains. So each prompt was designed to target specific skills or domains: reading, writing, listening, speaking, culture, and vocabulary. And this allowed us to focus on the various aspects of language learning and what students need to have exposure to in order to level up their skills in the world language classroom. Next, we created contextualized and culturally authentic scenarios. So we developed AI prompts that reflect authentic and real world scenarios learners might actually encounter when using a language. This involves participatory dialogue with follow-up questions. And these context-rich prompts encourage meaningful communication as well as critical thinking. We integrated cultural themes that aligned with our learning objectives. So this will engage learners in both language practice and cultural exploration. We then designed prompts with specific language structures. So they were crafted to emphasize particular linguistic structures like verb tense, question formation, vocabulary, things that learners need to practice at each level of language learning. And finally, we refined the database of prompts for clarity and practical application. So we iterated on the prompts generated by ChatGPT, ensuring that each one was very clear, and then asking the right things so that the responses make sense and are giving practical application of the language as well as feedback in certain scenarios, which we'll see in a bit. That they were pedagogically sound and then appropriately challenging, again, for each language, not jumping levels. And then we can talk about what we found as far as what's the anatomy of a prompt that really gets you that dialogue with ChatGPT in a way that's beneficial and not, hallucinating content, things like that. So we have essentially four things that compose a prompt. First, we have in language, which is where you insert the language that you'd like to practice. Explain the steps of a complex process like cooking a dish or setting up technology. So here you see the chatbot's role, the learner's role, and the nature of the interaction. So as we say, after listening, I'll summarize the steps back to you. Then we say, I am a learner at the advanced level of the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. Please remain at that level throughout our exchange. So not only do we give it the genre with the theme and task, we also give it the level and the language complexity. I'll pass it over to Amanda to talk more about the framework.
Yes, just another note on this. There is actually no order to any of these. You can put these components in any kind of order, and we can talk more about that when you see some of the other prompts. But this is just sort of one way that the four elements came together. So the framework that we decided to use, and when we say framework, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out how would language educators want to access this material. And so we spent a lot of time researching different criteria categories for identifying things in a prompt. And so what you see before you is kind of a spreadsheet light. This is the layout that we have in our database itself, but we've sort of extracted it here in a more visually pleasing way. The elements we decided to tag the prompts for are before you. So you see we have the prompt itself in the middle, and because we want this to be useful across languages, we've put the word language in caps lock each time. And so then the user can go through and just sort of feed in whatever language it is they're working with at the moment. On the right-hand side, we have sorted the prompts by primary skill, keeping in mind that in some cases, the divisions between skills is somewhat artificial because they work together. We wanted to identify primarily what it was that the learner would be working on. We have the proficiency level. Again, these are the main levels from the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. After the prompt, you see the language competence. In some cases here, we had grammatical structure. In other cases, we had functional roles, things like narrative structure or talking about things in the future, stuff like that. And then the ACTFL alignment is sort of a more specific assessment of what the prompt is meant to target. You'll notice that in the ACTFL alignment column that we have the sublevels indicated. So we have novice mid and intermediate mid. We did have the prompt after we fed them into the chatbot. This was something that they assessed as being specific to that sublevel, but Sabrina and I were unable to determine any kind of meaningful difference between the prompt when it was targeting novice mid and when it was targeting novice high. So what we did was actually condense these nuanced versions over here on the left-hand side into the main level. So that's something there so you can understand a little bit more about why it looks that way. And then this particular set of prompts, we have notes from the test. Lots of things can be indicated here. These particular prompts don't have any sort of notes, but I will fast forward to ones that do. So you'll see here on our listening and speaking prompts, if you want to hear ChatGPT talk to you with a voice, you have to initiate it with your own voice. And so that requires you to use ChatGPT on some kind of mobile device because the voice component doesn't seem to be activated on the desktop version. So we have that indicated in the prompt. And then in other cases, there may be situations of bias or other things that you want to draw out. So we'll see a couple of examples. We're going to give you some demos, but we wanted to show you here a little bit about what this database looks like before you get into it. You'll notice that it's set up like a spreadsheet in such a way that you can actually come to any of these top column headings and sort. So if you wanted to sort by activities that were just by listening or proficiency level that was just intermediate, you could actually do a subsort before you even started going through the database. So drum roll, please. This is the product. We've got some screenshots here from the website. We've named the website that hosts our database Prompted or Prompted, however you want to say it, AI Prompts for Language Educators. You have the link on the screen, and someone will also put that in the chat for you. And I'm going to take you now to this website so you can see a little bit about what it looks like. Let's see. I've just put the, thank you, Amanda. So it's a fairly simple website. We've got kind of our design up at the top. And then you'll see we've got our mission, and there's basically two ways to interact with the website. On the left-hand side, you have a link to the prompt database. And then on the right-hand side, you have a link to an intake form. I'll talk a little bit more about this after I show you the database, but essentially we are hoping that this open educational resource can participate in the larger ecosystem of open educational practices. In order to do that, we want to give people a chance to use the tool, but then also to give feedback and to submit back things that they've innovated on their own that could have a likely home in this kind of database. So this is a space for us to communicate with people who are using the tool. So let me take you to the prompt database. It looks like a spreadsheet, but you'll see here, if you click on these little funnels over here, you can filter by different levels and also by different skills. And essentially, it looks exactly like you saw on the slide, except for we've put the prompt here in bold. This allows you to click on it, highlight it, copy, paste it, and put it into your chatbot. Sabrina and I were working exclusively with ChatGPT 4.0, but you can just then sub out the word language wherever you see it in any of the prompts, and then you can go for there. So over here in the notes column, you'll see that we have each time this note thing replicated. We did that because if you were to sort, we wanted any user to be able to see the notes available for all that type without having to interact with the whole database. So that's basically it. We have about 100 prompts in here, and all the ones that require you to use the mobile device will be starred here in this column. You see that they go by skill. So you have all the listening ones, and they're organized by all the speaking ones, etc. So we encourage you to sort of click around and try it out. I'll take you back to the website itself and introduce you to the intake form. So we'd mentioned that we really want to invite people to share back what they've done with their prompts. And so what we have here is just a simple Google form that encourages people to share back prompts that they've used or tweaks that they've made to prompts that we have in our database that we can feed back. So what this does is it basically asks you for your prompt. It asks you what it targets, and then it asks you if you've tested it with a chatbot and when you tested it. I suspect that as the language learning models continue to advance, things will change. You know that if you put a prompt into Chat GPT right now, and then you did it a few minutes from now, you would get a different interaction. It would give you a different kind of situation. So that's exciting, but it's also the kind of thing that we want to track as researchers, because we want to see what is the full bouquet of offerings that that the chatbot gives you. We've also included a list here for attributions. So we have a Creative Commons license on this resource, where we want to sort of encourage people, if they do share, to also let us know how we can cite them in the appropriate way. So we encourage you to share your prompts with us, and we're hopeful that we can sort of gather, if you will, a really nice, comprehensive resource for using chatbots in the classroom. So what Sabrina and I are going to do now is take you through a demonstration of each of the types of prompts so you can get a sense to see what this looks like if you haven't done this kind of thing before.
All right, so we'll start with listening and we'll go through each of the domains that we've listed in the prompt database. So starting with listening, here's the prompt that I said out loud to Chat GPT, because it's really important to note that if you give it this prompt as a text, it's not capable of then switching to speaking. So you have to open up the, on your phone, open up Chat GPT, and then where the search bar or the chat box is, there's a little like listening audio symbol, and you click on that, and then it takes you to a screen where it shows you a circle that like loads as you're speaking. So you do that, and then you read out loud the prompt to it. So the prompt is as follows: tell me the names of common items found in a classroom in Spanish. Afterward, quiz me on the definitions of the items in English. Ask me one question at a time before asking me another. I'm a learner at the novice level of the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. Please remain at that level throughout our exchange. And so then note that all of this happened speaking back and forth, and then it will transcribe the text once you exit the speaking function of ChatGPT. So it says, de acuerdo, aquí tienes algunos objetos de aula: el cuaderno, el bolígrafo, la computadora, el reloj, la ventana y la puerta. Primera pregunta: ¿qué es el cuaderno en inglés? So note that it had trouble switching back and forth between Spanish and English in this particular prompt. Although when Amanda tried it in French, it was able to switch back and forth. So then I said notebook back to it, and it essentially went through this list asking me, what is this in English? And we also tried it with true or false questions. So it would ask things like, true or false, the el bolígrafo is what you write in, right? So obviously false, it's the thing you write with. So it's capable of asking different types of comprehension questions, which you can switch up based on what level the learner is at.
So I will take you through a reading demonstration. So the way that you read this is up here. This little bubble here on the right is the prompt that we gave it. So give me 3 short descriptions of common professions in French, then quiz me on the descriptions in English. I'm a learner at the novice level of the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. Remain at that level throughout our exchange. So I typed this in, so you don't see the little microphone. So you know I pasted this text. So it comes up with 3 common professions in French, and then it gives me 3 words in French, and it gives me definitions. I hope everyone's ears are red, because we see some things here happening in terms of gender that are maybe suboptimal. What you notice is that French is a language that has biological gender, also has grammatical gender. And so what it's done here is it's given me three professions, but it's given them to me in the masculine singular form. So that's something we've noted in our column with notes as an area of bias. And so there are things that you can do to tweak or sort of go around that. But it is something that is replicated for us here, so we get a chance to sort of see it firsthand. What follows after each word, so professeur, médecin, cuisinier, is a definition in French of what that person does. And so then it's going to give me a quiz. We're trying to test comprehension here. So it's quizzing me in the language that I've talked to it in. So that's English. So you see here, I'm answering. So it said, okay, who is the professional that helps sick people get better? And I said, cook. And it said, no, the right answer is doctor. So you get this kind of corrective feedback. And then it goes through all three of the options. And one thing that's really interesting to point out here is that because we learned this in testing the prompts, but because we gave it a very explicit task, it was very clear to the chatbot and to the learner when you had completed the task. We said 3 short descriptions. It gave us 3 short descriptions. It tested us on each of them, and then it said, great job. Then it gave us a quick recap. And the thing that makes, I think, interactions with the chatbot so exciting is that then it's going to generalize on this. It's going to say, hey, do you want to do this again? Do you want to practice more professions? Do you want to do this with some other kind of word? And that's really exciting. Because ultimately we're never going to be able to generate all the prompts, but what we can generate is a prompt that keeps generating other prompts. It sounds like syntax. And so what's cool here is that you could imagine giving to a learner, okay, go chat with your bot about, professions, but then, do two additional quizzes with it on related topics. And so then the learner could actually inject here a bit of personalization. In most cases, if you don't tell it that you're going to explicitly end with some kind of participation on the learner's end, it will always propose to you that you do this with another activity. And so that leaves open this possibility of continuing the exchange.
As for writing, actually, I noticed here in the prompt, I forgot to switch it to Spanish, but it still remembered from our previous interactions that I'm probably going to want to speak Spanish with it. So the prompt for writing that we're demonstrating here is, I'll write a short journal entry in language about my day. Can you give me feedback on my grammar and expression? I'm a learner at the novice level of the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. Please remain at that level throughout our exchange. So then it always will say, sure, feel free to write your entry in Spanish and I'll provide feedback at the novice level. So I gave it an example journal entry and I made the errors that you commonly see at this level, particularly when students in Spanish in our department are taking like the LPE writing section. We see things like switching from the preterite form to then using the present tense, even though they're still talking in the past tense, things like that. So it goes through and it corrects the errors that I made. So for instance, with the one I mentioned about switching from preterite to present, number 2, I have nosotros vamos a comer pizza porque nos gusta mucho. And it says, correction, nosotros fuimos a comer pizza. And it goes through and corrects all of those errors in my example entry. If you want to go to the next one, Amanda. And then it also provides the full text that I gave it with those corrections inserted. So this is the, I guess, graded version of what I gave it for a writing sample. So very impressive in what it gives for feedback and then how it corrects that in real time.
So I'll take you through an activity. This time we're trying to learn different kinds of vocabulary. So the prompt is, help me learn new words by showing me names for different food items in different parts of the French-speaking world. I'll repeat each word after you say it. I'm a learner at the novice level. So I've actually typed this in because you don't see the little microphone thing, but I've told it that I want to repeat it after you say it. And I did this because I want you to see the way in which it tries to give pronunciation support, which may or may not be enough with your learners. So this one says, great, let's dive into some regional foods. So we have France. So we have some sort of bare nouns here, baguette, croissant, fromage. I find it kind of amusing the way that it's giving pronunciation support. It seems to be cutting the words up in syllables, but not actually giving any phonetic support for how those are realized. So this is something to take into account. This kind of activity might be helpful for learners who already have some pronunciation under their belt, such that they could look at that syllable and know that it's pronounced qua and not croy or something else. And then you see that it's sort of taking us on a little bit of a tour. It gives us some items from Quebec, and then it gives us some items from West Africa and sort of syllabifies the words that way. It ends again with another of these iteration questions. How did you do? Because we said that we were going to repeat it. And then it says, do you want to try more regions or do you want to practice a specific set of words in terms of repeating them?
For speaking, again, notice it has a little microphone here. So I gave it the prompt by speaking to it. This time I asked ChatGPT to describe its morning routine in Spanish. So I'll listen and then tell you mine using similar phrases. I'm a learner at the intermediate level of the ACTFL proficiency guidelines. Please remain at that level throughout the exchange. So it gives me its morning routine, using those phrases we see often in the classroom, me despierto, me levanto, hago mi cama, things like that. And then I go ahead and give mine. And then ChatGPT responds saying, like, your morning routine sounds organized and balanced. You eat something simple but rich, and then you prepare for the day. It's great that you give yourself time for all of this. It really gives you a lot of commentary on what you're saying in your back and forth dialogue. And then it keeps asking questions like, I was at the point ready to end this conversation, and it keeps like, so what do you then like to do? Or what's your favorite part of the day? And finally I'm like, okay, I gotta go, bye. So it just keeps going until you end it.
Which can be a really nice way to kind of continue those interactions that you imagine learners having with each other in the classroom or in public places.
Oh, and one more thing I forgot to mention, sorry, Amanda.
Yeah.
I did a couple of things like, just purposely making mistakes without asking it to correct me. And it's interesting that it does give that implicit corrective feedback. So I don't think it's in this one, but at one point I made the mistake of like,
It
me
was with
gusta.
Gustave. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So often, at that novice level, we'll see students having issues with making gustar plural or singular with what follows. So I said something like "me gusta los huevos," and it came back and said like, "Oh, los huevos son delicioso," and like kept giving me plural adjectives and verbs associated with los huevos. So we know that it's giving that implicit corrective feedback despite me not asking for it.
So it seems like the default, if you don't give an explicit statement in your prompt of the kind of feedback for the chatbot to give you, it will default to implicit feedback. And by that, it will sort of signal, like Sabrina said, whatever it is you got wrong through other means. Like, hey, you didn't know this was plural? Here's 3 pieces of evidence to show you this is plural. But you can also ask it for explicit feedback. So that's something that we've seen in some of our prompts. So I'll take you through a culture activity. So this says, the prompt says, I want to learn about social customs in a French-speaking country. Can you describe how people typically greet each other in Madagascar? After listening, I'll compare it to the greeting customs in my own culture. So what I've done here is something different than we've seen before. We're telling the bot, tell me some information. And then when I hear or see what you have to say, then I'm going to compare it with a situation that's unique to me. So this sort of implicates your learner in a larger kind of participation than just answer this question or, answer this single quiz translation item. So here we get some explanation about how greetings are in Madagascar. We have some sort of phrases. We have handshake, asking about someone's well-being, how you show respect. And then you see we've relaunched the prompt on the right-hand side. Everything is the same, except this time we've asked about Cameroon. And so you see here it's given some information. In particular, it's pulled out different phrases, but there's this idea of asking about someone's family, which is different in this setting. And then we have this notion of titles being important. You'll notice that it remembers that you said you were going to do something. And so it doesn't forget. It says, hey, now it's your turn. So how does this measure up with those in your culture? And so this is where the learner can really share in whatever language that you're using with the chatbot, what the outcome is.
Okay, so we found some limitations with ChatGPT that we've mentioned a little bit throughout. So just to reiterate that, for listening and speaking, you must speak prompts to ChatGPT if you want it to speak to you. Anything written in the chat is automatically responded to with written text. So when you're speaking to ChatGPT, again, when you exit the chat speaking function, it will always transcribe the oral exchange. Sometimes the transcriptions are a bit messed up because it seems to have trouble going back and forth between languages. So in that sense, for the listening prompts, the learner's comprehension is tested by them being required to provide their answers orally. And then again, for the listening prompts, it always transcribes exchanges, even oral ones. So without seeing the transcript, learners must respond orally, not in writing, which it's a bit tricky when it spits out a ton of things for you to remember. So you have to ask it for like one or a couple examples. Otherwise, we're getting into them having to remember all the things that were said rather than just reproducing it. Um, and then one language is more reliable than code switching. Like I said, it seems to have trouble switching between languages, and it does best speaking one language at a time. So in the example I showed you, when I asked it to code switch, tell me the names in language, then ask me questions in English, it remained in Spanish, although it could have interpreted my in English being that it's saying en inglés, right? So it still was asking me to produce English. And the pronunciation of the non-English language may sometimes be anglicized when it does code switch back and forth.
I had a funny situation with a French prompt that I tested where we were doing something very basic like items in a classroom, and one of the words was stylo, a word for pen. And because I had asked the bot to go back and forth between French and English, sometimes she said stylo and sometimes she said stylo, and that was very strange. I couldn't figure out how to predict one over the other, and I realized that I had confused her by speaking multiple languages to her. So we noted that this is a thing that can happen when you code switch. So it's something to sort of be aware of if you're asking that kind of flexibility out of your chatbot. So I'll sort of talk a little bit about our conclusions. So we're hopeful here that what we've demonstrated to you will make you feel good as language educators, because this sort of trope that the bots are coming for our jobs and the bots are coming for language instruction is super duper false. But what I think that we do have is this idea of what the bots can do well and how we can sort of harness what they know how to do, which is follow instructions in the form of prompts, so that we can maybe lighten the load or diversify the kinds of interactions we ask our learners to carry out. So from this project, we, Sabrina and I, have a much greater understanding of ChatGPT 4.0. We went into this expecting a bunch of technical limitations, maybe some pragmatic limitations. So this idea of, okay, I'm going to change languages. Okay, I'm going to speak to you and you're going to speak back. So I have to use my voice to initiate. But we didn't expect the physical limitations. And it's kind of sweet and endearing. When we started some of these activities, we would say, teach me some words about places in the city. And it would say, okay. And it would spit out like 10 or 12 items. And we would laugh and laugh because we thought, oh, our chatbot doesn't know that humans have a limited working memory. So we would have to say, no, 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 we can't do that. We can only parse 4 to 7 things at a time. Why don't you tell us 1 at a time? Or why don't you tell us 2 at a time? But there's no way the chatbot knows that because it thinks it's just dispensing information to you, another computer. So that was kind of a sweet finding, kind of in an adorable way. We hope that we have provided here some concrete examples of what you can do with chat and how you can sort of plug and play and encourage your learners to go explore on their own, while sort of keeping this lens of sort of critical eye to what they're seeing and why they might be seeing it. We have a much clearer idea now what makes an optimal prompt. So you really have to say, what is the role of the chatbot? What is the role of the learner? How are we going to interact with each other? What language or languages are we going to use? What theme or task are we going to complete together? And how hard is it going to be? We showed you some different ways to build in varying degrees of learner participation, and we're sure that that can be exploited too to sort of larger levels, the higher and the skill level you go with the learner. But we hope that we've shown that there are some possible meaningful roles for human chatbot interactions and language acquisition. But we really encourage you as language educators and as learners, if you're autodidacts, to think about what this might complement or replace. This isn't replacing interaction with a teacher. It's not replacing interaction with a skilled, experienced user. What it might be is a new or different or complementary way to do activities in a workbook, or to do idea generation for a writing task, or to learn vocabulary. So if we can think of a way in which chatbot can do the very specific things that it can do well in our language curriculum, I think that will take away some of the fear of, oh no, AI is coming to sort of take over the whole thing. So our next steps, so we have the OER and we invite people to contribute and test it. Sabrina and I tested these prompts in Spanish and French with a medium language of English. We started preliminary testing on the same set of prompts in other languages that she and I work with. So that's Portuguese, Norwegian, Swedish, and Korean. And so if you are a user of one of these languages and want to tell us what you found with the set, we would love to hear about it. Ideally, we retest these prompts in all the languages and then we refine them in ways that they can work across languages. This helps us build the super prompt, if you will. We're also considering additional criteria for tagging the prompts. So I told you that we had spent a lot of time figuring out how language educators and learners might want to talk about prompts and how they might want to access information in a way that's meaningful to them. There is a really cool text that has a framework that we didn't end up using, but that we could potentially add on as an additional layer. And this text gives 7 different roles that AI can assume in an interaction with the human. So AI as a mentor, as a tutor, as a coach, as a teammate, as a student, as a simulator, and as a tool. And we had thought that that might be a meaningful way to classify it. But given that most of us have language teacher training background, we thought that it would make more sense to sort of go through ACTFL and go through thematic ways. But I think, again, the utility and how we tag these prompts really depends on how educators start thinking of the role of chatbots and of AI in and outside their learning spaces. And I think that's going to sort of help drive the kinds of activities that they can really participate in, because it isn't the full gamut of experiences in the language classroom. We would like to sort of generate additional prompts. We've tried to target a variety of genres and a variety of sort of levels of language, but ultimately we've left things out. And so we're really excited to see what other people can share back with us. We mentioned to you that we identified in our notes column when we encountered bias. So I talked to you about how the professions came up in a masculine singular form in French, which is a language that has grammatical gender. Sabrina had something similar, but it was a different kind of bias. So she had asked in the prompt for popular movie quotes in Spanish, and what it gave instead of movie quotes from a language or from a country where Spanish was spoken. Instead, it gave American movie quotes that had been translated into Spanish. I think it was Star Wars, wasn't it? Yeah, so so there's a lot of different kinds of bias. It doesn't always come to you in the form of like word endings. Sometimes it comes to you in the level of language or even the topics that you're talking about. So we would like to kind of get a better sense of what that bias looks like so that we can flag it, and then it's up to the users to sort of see, do they want their learners to challenge it in the exchange, or do they want to find a way around it so that they can do something with the form. So that's all we have for you today. We're really excited to answer your questions. If you have any follow-up questions, you can reach out to us at these email addresses. Our website also has a project email, which is prompted.langprompts@gmail.com, and we would love to take your questions.
I see there's some in the chat already, so why don't we start with
Oh.
Mandy's question. Curious whether you've tried the prompts with other AI tools. UMN is encouraging folks to use Microsoft Copilot to minimize privacy and accessibility issues. Wondered if you think functionality will be the same. So we did, before we started generating the prompts with ChatGPT, we did a lot of research just comparing freely accessible chatbots and asking questions like, does it have a speaking integration? What data was the model trained on? Does it have an image generator? Does it have access to the internet in real time? And in comparing the different chatbots that are available, we chose ChatGPT because it seemed to have the most accessible speaking integration or speaking function that doesn't require additional tools integrations that you have to get in order to access that. And also thinking of accessibility, that we don't have like Microsoft Suite at the U of M. So that would be like a whole license thing rather than an individualized login with ChatGPT. And as far as the critical reflection and analysis, it is capable of pointing out errors and not giving the correction. So that is something we could do to have learners think through their errors and correct those errors on their own rather than just giving, direct feedback from ChatGPT. That's a really good question. Do you want to take the next one, Amanda?
Hey, do you want
I
to
can.
moderate? There's a whole list here I haven't read through.
I can answer the next one too from Dan. It says, have you tested the prompts using advanced voice mode? So that is the mode that we were describing when you go into ChatGPT and click the audio bar thing, and then it generates the little circle that I was talking about. So that's the advanced mode with 4.0. And then I guess one thing that you see with that is it's just quicker in its response. Like if you take a pause when you're saying the prompt, it'll right away speak back to you.
Are there other questions? Let's see.
So there was a question about the sort of the bias. I think you addressed it a little bit, Amanda, when you were wrapping things up. But there's a question from Luis asking if like the gender bias was limited to humans, or if in languages that have grammatical gender, you also saw this kind of bias in terms of the vocabulary words that were generated. Was there a tendency towards more masculine words versus feminine words when you, like, for example, if you were asking about classroom items or something like that?
Ah, that's
That
a good
is
question.
something you noticed,
So
but
grammatical gender, not biological gender mapped onto a
correct.
language of grammatical gender. I don't know that I made that observation, and I don't think that I didn't study that observation. Did you notice anything, Sabrina, in Spanish? Like, did it always yield more masculine nouns versus feminine when you asked it just for inanimate objects?
That's a really good question.
I don't know. We could
No,
certainly look at that.
I don't think so. I mean, if we look back at the listening example that I gave when I asked for objects in the classroom, we see like el cuaderno, el bolígrafo, la computadora, la ventana, la puerta. I think it just gave nouns. It didn't necessarily skew one way or the other as far as I could see, but we could like actually go through and count which
mm.
one. Yeah.
Well, it also yields a different list, a slightly different list each time you input the prompt. So I don't remember them being heavily imbalanced, but that's a good thing to look at.
Hmm.
One of the things I noticed too with that French example, at least, is that there was no article provided. So for
Yes.
the student who may not know that these are masculine forms could make assumptions that this is used for both men, women, non-binary people, right?
Mhm.
So that seems to be a limitation of the output of the chatbot,
Yes.
indicating the grammatical gender of the word.
I played with this on the French side, and it works if you tell it like if you're doing nouns and you say like include the article, or if you say the full form, it doesn't know what you mean. But if you say include the article, it does. The problem is if you're working in a language that doesn't have an article, then it doesn't know what that means. And so sometimes you get spurious information. But that might be a way that we could like target that kind of prompt in particular. Those are mostly at the novice level where we were doing vocab generation, but that's a good point.
Yeah, there's another question about bias that just came into the chat, and this is from Linda. And they said, thinking in terms of language changing through contact and use, and the biases that you've already noted, I'm wondering how much impact ChatGPT's language will have on language learners and on the language itself over the time. Like, will it have any impact on language variation or language development?
I love that question. You must be a sociolinguist at heart. To answer the question, I think it really depends on how this goes in society, right? Like, I think it depends on what kinds of language gets used to train these models moving forward. If you look at the US anyway, I would say there are more people speaking a version of American Spanish that they probably mix a lot with English than not. And so it would be exciting to think that that kind of data could be used to train it. But I know that's probably sort of far off. I know that in the meantime, linguists in particular who work on this kind of thing, who work in this kind of area, have actually started training their own models to work on a specific kind of like contact language or ethnolect, depending on what the research is about, so that you can inform the model accordingly. But yeah, I think it's reasonable to think that it might cause changes. Some of the research I do in sociolinguistics uses creative spellings on social media, like in comments on YouTube and on Twitter and things like that, to track sound changes. And we absolutely can predict them based on how people spell things creatively. So I don't think it's unreasonable to think that the genre could have some kind of an effect. Um,
So
I think
yeah, there's
too to
another. Go
Go
ahead.
ahead.
Sabrina.
I think
Oh.
to add on that as well, like we see a heavy use of like if you ask ChatGPT to write a caption for social media or something like that, you see it use things like delve a lot. I think people call it the delve effect.
Oh, yes.
And like a rich tapestry and like these pretty like redundant phrases you'll see over and over. So it could be interesting to see if we notice more of that, of those particular words used in language, spoken language, as a result of using ChatGPT to help with writing.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there are some people who have looked at linguistic bias in chat GPT output in terms of like saying that something is wrong when it's actually part of a different dialect or language variety. And there's another question in here about that. So like, you know, where is it? Like, should prompts suggest a specific dialect, or should they request more sort of generic or standardized language? Like, I don't know if
I
you've
mean, I
thought.
think the prompts can do whatever you want,
Yeah.
but where you get thrown off the bus is that the GP chat doesn't know what that means, and so it will just give you its best guess. So if you said like, I want you to answer me in a variety of Puerto Rican Spanish spoken in this part of New York, it would be like, yeah, sure, and then it would it would just give you Spanish, right? Whatever it knows to be Spanish, and so we would have to go do research to figure out like, what has it been trained on? What does this thing reasonably think is Spanish? Why is it mapping it to X, Y, and Z? So it really depends on sort of how specific you are, I think, with your dialect. If you're doing a difference between like Peninsular Spanish and Latin American Spanish, obviously those are both more high resource than like multi-ethnolex or ethnolex that you find in a specific country. So you would have a better chance at getting something that would be what you wanted. But ultimately, you have to constantly fact check. I kind of think of this as like, I don't know, it's like having a robot assistant that's like a small child. You accept what they tell you with grace, and then you fact check everything, because you don't necessarily know if the frame of reference for the question you asked is the same for the chatbot as it is for you. And I suspect this will get a lot better. Depending on what language it is that you work with again. So we have run up against lots of different things. When I was testing the prompts in Norwegian, I had a very different experience than when I was testing the prompts in French. So some of these languages are a little more well represented in the training data. And so you see that, and just in terms of what it proposes to you in terms of answers, and then sort of the nuance it gives you in its ability to respond back if you're asking it to respond back in the language.
Yeah, and your response to that question, Amanda, is related to a question that Mandy had asked about sort of the accuracy of information, particularly when you're giving it culture prompts. Like,
Mm.
how do we know whether the bot is actually saying something about the culture that is representative of that culture or cultures?
Yeah.
And is like who does this fact checking? Is it us as the instructors? Is it the students? Is this a way for us to bring more critical thinking into the way that students are interacting with the bot, that kind of thing?
I mean, we believe nothing from our bot. We love our bot, but we ultimately, I think we're more critical of our bots than accepting. We fact checked all of the cultural prompts we put in to make sure it didn't yield anything spurious with like things that you would reasonably choose. So like I plugged in every country in West Africa and all of the places that are francophone in Europe, and all of the places that are francophone in the US that have, or in America that have sort of French designations. But yeah, ultimately, I think what this is a teachable moment for your learner. So I think it's fair to give them this prompt, but you also have to distill in your learner the same critical eye that you have as a teacher. And so I don't think that you would ever want to just package this up and say, okay, go practice with chat. You should say, okay, let's go practice with chat. Let's see what it knows now. I mean, this is a learning model that's constantly evolving. And so, even the depth of which these prompts have been tested will change drastically in a couple of months. And so we're excited to see like what new things will it be able to pull out with the same kind of prompt. But I think you really, to do this right, you have to instill in your learner the same level of sort of critical, I don't know what you want to call it, a critical eye to what it's telling you. So I would ask your learners to do it. And then they need to seek like outside resources to check what it's saying. And then in spaces where it's giving you spurious information, figure out, try to assess why. Why is it doing that? Where is it getting that from?
So we have a question from Peter. I'm really glad that they asked this question. And it's, I teach an Indigenous language. How can First Nation teachers use AI when our languages are only known in small communities and known by a small number of fluent speakers? And I think we could ask this question of many languages, not just Indigenous languages, but languages that are that have small populations of speakers and may not have the same written traditions that European languages have, for instance. But any thoughts you have on that would be really interesting.
Yeah, so the short answer is you can't use it in the same ways because we talk a lot about language learning models where they've been trained on data, and so that makes the languages that they've been trained a lot on, where they've gotten a lot of exposure, what we call high resource languages, and then languages that they haven't been trained on at all, where they're just guessing, or languages that they've been trained on just a little bit, are low resource languages. And so there's a couple of ways around it. One thing that you might consider is if there is any representation of your language in training data, and this often comes in like government documents. I'm thinking of like the documents of the European Council, documents from the sort of official offices in the US, you might consider, you could ask it cultural information. So a lot of cultural information can be obtained through other languages. So it can read and learn a lot about language and language communities through English. So it can actually give you that kind of information, but not giving it to you in the language of your community, but in another language about your community. That's sort of one way around, but you can't really target form always in the same way. Another way is if you have sort of college-aged students in your community that are interested in this kind of research, they can actually take spoken and written data and train their own model such that you could build a chatbot that is specific to the language in your community. That's a lot more work and requires technical skill, but we're starting to see that. I work in the linguistics department, and we're starting to see students interested in this kind of thing, bringing representation to these kinds of approaches, but having to do it themselves because there maybe isn't recognition at the sort of large general level.
Mhm. And
Um,
Kathleen asked a good question too about privacy issues and asking students to use ChatGPT in class. There are privacy issues with ChatGPT in the sense that if you don't limit the data that it has access to, it can use that for training in the future. So you can restrict its permission to your data, its ability to reuse what you're inputting. And you can also use an account that's not like you can use it without creating an account. But if you create your own account, that gives you sort of peace of mind that your stuff is between you and ChatGPT. You can delete the history. Again, you can turn off the data, the access to your data. And then maybe just giving students like a beginning like 101 about, don't tell it sensitive information about yourself and things that you wouldn't want because, what we put on the internet also on social media and all of that can become publicly available. So just having that same caution when you use ChatGPT.
I
so
see that.
there,
Go ahead.
so I think we have time for one more question. So the I'm going to jump to Dolly's question because I think it's kind of an interesting way to think about ChatGPT creatively. And so she's asking if you've ever used ChatGPT to represent historical characters. There's some folks at Missouri who are doing that, but they've only been doing it in English and not in the target language. It makes me think of things like global simulation and
Yeah.
reenacting the past and stuff like that.
I don't know that we had any prompts that touched on that here, although that might be a thing we could move, a direction we could move in. I was in a development project for French, an open educational resource for French, where we had an activity that did something like that. It was like a quiz game, kind of like that game, I forget what it's called, where you have like an identity, but it's on a card on your head and you don't know who it is, and so you have to ask questions to figure out who you are. Heads up, thank you. And so basically it was a game like that, except we fed into the prompt, I am one of 5 historical figures in Switzerland or something like that. And then it was like, ask me questions using whatever structure we were doing, interrogative structure in French, until I can figure out who I am. And then after like, I don't know, 5 or 6 exchanges, then it would reveal who you were. But it would give you clues based on, the 5 people that you had input, or 5 people that it could identify as being famous historical figures in Switzerland. So that was one way I had seen it used, but I've seen it used in the style. So like write this recipe in the style of Baudelaire, or right, like write a poem in the style of insert famous poet here. But other than that, I haven't seen it used in any kind of representation of historical figures.
Okay, well, so that wrap gets us to the top of the hour. So I want to thank Amanda and Sabrina for sharing their work, and I want to thank everybody who attended and for all of your great questions. It was a really good discussion, and I'm sure that this website is going to get a lot of traffic after this presentation. Somebody asked about recording. We have recorded this. The recording will be available on the Carla website. Karen just put a link in the chat. Give us about a week and we'll get it up. And thank you so much. We hope to see you at a Carla presentation in the future. Have a great day.